May 8, 1945. Churchill stands before massive crowds in London. Britain has survived. The empire still spans a quarter of the globe. From Cairo to Calcutta, from Sydney to Singapore, the Union Jack still flies. The war is won. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Britain won the war, then lost the peace to its ally. Within 18 months of victory, Britain would face a financial catastrophe that would do more damage to its global position than all of Hitler's bombs combined. The carefully constructed system that had sustained British power for over a century would come crashing down. And the architect wasn't in Berlin, it was in Washington. This is the story of how the United States dismantled the British Empire. Not with tanks or planes, but with a loan agreement. Let's start with the reality Britain faced in 1945. Britain had spent 6 years fighting a total war against Nazi Germany, and I mean total war. Nearly a quarter of its national wealth, gone. Spent on planes, ships, tanks, and ammunition. Its factories? Converted entirely to war production. Its exports? They hadn't just dipped, they had collapsed. By 1944, export volume had plummeted to less than 1/3 of its pre-war levels, leaving the country with a massive trade deficit. By 1945, Britain owed more than £3.3 billion to other nations, mostly to its own colonies and dominions in what were called sterling balances. On top of that, the sudden end of Lend-Lease from the United States threatened to push the country into a financial Dunkirk. The country was running on fumes, borrowed time, and borrowed money. But here's the critical detail most people miss. Britain didn't just need money to rebuild, it needed a specific kind of money. It needed dollars. See, before the war, Britain ran a closed trading system called imperial preference. This was the economic foundation of the empire. The British Empire traded primarily within itself, using pounds sterling. It worked beautifully for Britain. British manufactured goods flowed to India, Australia, Canada, and South Africa. Raw materials, cotton, rubber, minerals, and food, came back. The pound was the medium of exchange, and Britain controlled it. The system was self-sustaining. It was profitable. And most importantly, it kept Britain independent of other powers, particularly the United States. But the war shattered this carefully balanced system. By 1945, Britain's industrial capacity was exhausted. The country couldn't produce enough food to feed its population. It couldn't manufacture enough goods to export. Now, Britain needed to import massive amounts of food and raw materials to survive. And the countries that had these goods, primarily the United States and Latin America, didn't want pounds. They wanted dollars. Britain had a pound-based empire in a dollar-dominated world. Think about the trap Britain was in. The empire still existed on paper. The territories were still there. But Britain couldn't access the resources of its own empire without dollars to buy them on the international market. By August 1945, Britain's dollar reserves were nearly exhausted. At the current rate of spending, they'd run out completely within months. Without dollars, Britain couldn't buy food, couldn't import fuel, couldn't rebuild. So Britain did the only thing it could. It went to Washington with its hand out. Enter John Maynard Keynes, perhaps the most brilliant economist of the 20th century, dispatched by the newly elected Labour government to negotiate what everyone in London assumed would be a generous gift or a low-interest loan. After all, Britain and America had just fought together. The Atlantic Charter had promised a world of shared prosperity. Surely America would help its closest ally without strings attached. Keynes certainly thought so. In his initial proposals, he suggested Britain needed around $5 billion as an outright grant. He was about to learn a very expensive lesson about how power actually works. The negotiations began in September 1945 and lasted 3 brutal months. The Americans had a very clear agenda. This wasn't about charity. This wasn't even primarily about money. This was about remaking the global economic order. The United States had emerged from World War II in an unprecedented position. Its industrial capacity had doubled during the war, while Europe's had been destroyed. It held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. Its military was the strongest on Earth, and it had a monopoly on atomic weapons. American policymakers looked at the post-war world and saw an opportunity to reshape it according to American interests. Free trade, open markets, dollar-based transactions, a system where American goods, American capital, and American influence could flow freely around the globe. And Britain, desperate, exhausted, broke, was going to be the battering ram. On December 6, 1945, the Anglo-American Loan Agreement was signed. On paper, it looked almost reasonable. $3.75 billion loaned to Britain 2% annual interest. No payments required until 1951, giving Britain 6 years to recover. 50-year repayment period. Generous, right? Almost charitable compared to the harsh terms imposed after World War I. Now let's read the fine print. Article 8 demanded that Britain make the pound sterling fully convertible within 1 year. What does that mean in plain English? It means anyone holding pounds anywhere in the world could exchange them for dollars at fixed rates. Sounds technical. Sounds like boring monetary policy. But here's what it actually meant. Britain would lose control of its own currency. Think about this carefully. Britain didn't have enough dollars to back up all the pounds circulating in the global economy. There were billions of pounds in reserves held by other countries, by banks, and by traders. If everyone tried to convert their pounds to dollars at once, Britain would run out of dollars immediately. The Americans knew this, the British knew this, Keynes knew this, but the loan agreement demanded it anyway. But it gets worse. Article 9 of the agreement, the non-discrimination clause, required Britain to stop favoring its own colonies. It meant Britain could no longer use import quotas to protect Commonwealth producers. If Britain wanted to buy timber or wheat, it could no longer give preference to Canada or New Zealand over the United States. The translation? Britain had to throw open its captive markets to American goods. The empire was being forced open for business, American business. Think about the trap. First, Britain had to abandon the trade protections that kept its imperial economy functioning. Second, it had to make its currency convertible when it didn't have the reserves to back it up. Third, it had to grant the US equal access to a quarter of the world's population. All of this in exchange for a loan that, in the face of post-war inflation, would barely cover the cost of imports for the next 18 months. Lord Keynes himself called the terms harsh and humiliating. He wrote to his colleagues that the Americans were extracting their pound of flesh, but Britain had no choice. The alternative was mass starvation and economic collapse. Without American credit, Britain couldn't feed its people through the coming winter, which would turn out to be the most brutal in a century. So, Britain signed. Before the mission began, Keynes had argued that Britain should negotiate not as a beggar asking for a favor, but as a supplier of an essential service, the service of having held the line against fascism alone for years. He believed the world owed Britain a debt of honor. But by the time he left Washington, he had learned the hard truth. In the New World Order, there was no room for honor. There was only the dollar. July 15, 1947. Exactly 1 year after the loan was finalized, Britain made the pound convertible. What happened next was predictable, inevitable, and devastating. Within weeks, there was a catastrophic run on the pound. Everyone holding sterling, traders, governments, businesses, central banks, immediately started converting it to dollars. Because everyone could see that Britain didn't have enough dollars to back the conversions. It was obvious to anyone paying attention, so it became a race to get out before the collapse. Get your dollars now, before Britain runs out. Classic bank-run dynamics. Except the bank was the British Empire. In just 6 weeks, Britain lost nearly $1 billion in reserves. For context, that's more than a quarter of the entire American loan, evaporated in 42 days. Money that was supposed to rebuild Britain's economy, gone in a currency crisis that everyone saw coming. By early August, British officials were in a state of panic. On August 20, 1947, 5 weeks after convertibility began, Britain surrendered. The government suspended convertibility, reimposed capital controls, essentially admitted the experiment had failed. But the damage was done. The currency crisis destroyed what little confidence remained in British economic management. Investment fled. The pound's credibility was shattered. But here's the part that really matters, the part that exposes what this was really about. This wasn't some unpredictable accident. This wasn't a policy experiment that just went wrong. The Americans knew this would happen. The US Treasury had the numbers. They had economists who could do the math. They knew Britain didn't have anywhere near enough dollar reserves to support convertibility. In fact, American experts had warned explicitly that forcing convertibility so soon would trigger a crisis. The numbers were clear, so why force it? Because the crisis was the point. The loan wasn't designed to save the British Empire. It was designed to dismantle the barriers protecting it, and it worked perfectly. With the non-discrimination clauses of the loan in effect, Britain could no longer shut out American competition. American goods flooded into markets that had been closed for generations. By 1948, American exports to many parts of the former sterling area had surged, and American capital followed. American firms began establishing deep roots in Commonwealth nations like Canada, Australia, and the oil-rich Middle East. The empire wasn't conquered by an invading army. It was pried open from within, using Britain's own desperation as the lever. Now, before you think this is just anti-American history, let me be clear. This isn't about vilifying the United States. This is about understanding how power actually works. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about credit and aid. They are never neutral. When one nation needs money and another has it, the transaction isn't about generosity. It's about leverage. It's about reshaping the relationship between creditor and debtor. And that leverage comes with conditions. Always. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement was part of a broader American project, building a new global economic order with the United States at its center. This same pattern appears again and again. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, but required recipients to open their markets. The IMF and World Bank provided development loans with structural adjustment conditions. Modern debt diplomacy operates on the exact same principle. When Argentina borrows from the IMF, it comes with conditions that reshape currency policy, trade policy, fiscal policy. When developing nations need dollars, and they always need dollars, the money comes with conditions. The specific demands change depending on the decade and the dominant economic ideology. But the fundamental dynamic doesn't. Credit is control. And it's not just a Western phenomenon anymore. China's Belt and Road Initiative? Same playbook, different empire. Infrastructure loans to developing nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, secured against strategic assets. When countries can't repay, and the terms are often designed to make repayment difficult, China acquires ports, mines, telecommunications networks, political influence. Sri Lanka couldn't repay loans for the Hambantota port. China now controls it on a 99-year lease. Different creditor, same mechanism. This is why the British story matters, because it reveals something most economic history tries to hide. The rules-based international order everyone talks about? It was built on exactly this kind of financial coercion. Britain was the first major test case. Fast forward to today, the United States wields more financial power than Britain ever dreamed of at the height of its empire. The dollar is the global reserve currency. Nearly 60% of foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars, and it accounts for the vast majority of international trade. While SWIFT, the system that processes international bank transfers, is technically a Belgian cooperative, it effectively operates within the sphere of American influence because of the dollar's dominance. This gives the United States extraordinary power that Britain in 1945 would have envied. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the West didn't just send weapons, it deployed the ultimate financial weapon. They froze over $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. Think about that. Russia had saved up a $300 billion rainy day fund, and with a few keystrokes, the US and its allies made it inaccessible. They cut major Russian banks off from SWIFT and sanctioned thousands of entities, essentially locking the world's 11th largest economy out of the dollar system. This is why China is building alternative payment systems, why BRICS nations talk about de-dollarization, why some countries hold gold instead of dollars. They learned the lesson Britain learned in 1947. If you depend on someone else's currency, you live by their rules. And for dozens of developing nations right now, facing dollar-denominated debt, high interest rates, inflation, food crises, the choice Britain faced in 1945 is very, very real. Accept conditions that strip away economic sovereignty or face economic collapse and social chaos. Take the IMF loan with the structural adjustment conditions. Let foreign investors buy your state assets. Deregulate your financial sector. Cut social spending. Or watch your currency collapse, your people starve, and your government fall. The mechanisms have gotten more sophisticated, but the fundamental dynamic hasn't changed one bit since 1945. Aid is always leverage, and help always comes with a future bill. Britain paid that bill with an empire. What are we paying it with today? If this changed how you think about power and money, hit subscribe. We're digging into the mechanisms that actually shape our world, not the stories they tell you in textbooks.